Welcome, physiology students, to the cardiac cycle workshop. We're first going to start about talking about an oscilloscope versus an ECG. And in reference to the cardiac cycle refers to all of the events that happen within a single heartbeat of the heart. So it refers to all of the electrical events, the physiological events. And we're first going to talk a little bit about the electrical events in the cardiac cycle. To measure the electrical activity of the heart, we'll first talk about what an oscilloscope does. This detects the amplitude of an electrical signal when one cell is measured, and an oscilloscopes give us this graph of depolarization, and it can show us the shape of that depolarization curve. How an oscilloscope works, it places two leads, one inside an axon and one outside the axon to measure membrane potential. And when that cell is depolarized, we get a depolarization curve as shown here. So how does this relate to ECG or EKG? Well, an ECG involves shows the electrical changes on the skin where many cells are involved. And this specifically looks at the electrical changes that are occurring in the heart. And those electrical changes that occur in the heart are able to be detected on the skin. So a patient will be hooked up to an ECG machine via these several leads in specific places throughout the body. And by doing so, they're able to get these electrical changes on the skin that are coming from the heart. You might be wondering where EKG comes from. In German, cardio is K, so that's why they were first called EKGs. In English, cardio starts with the C, so that's why we refer to them as ECGs now. So if we look at this ECG reading, again, every heartbeat is determined by what's in this red box. So you can see several heartbeats over and over again here. And if we zoom in on one heartbeat, we see the depolarization that's occurring within the chambers of the heart. The P wave refers to the depolarization of the atria. And when you hear the word depolarization, that just means an electrical signal is being passed through that area of the heart. So the P wave refers to depolarization of the atria, which will lead to atrial contraction, because for any cell to contract, you need an electrical stimulus traveling through it first. The QRS complex refers to the depolarization of the ventricles. So the electrical signal travels from the atria to the ventricles, leading to ventricular contraction. And then the T wave refers to repolarization of the ventricles. And repolarization of the ventricles means that they become repolarized, they go back to normal or resting state. So this is an ECG reading, and that is what the P, QRS, and T complexes stand for. So then we'll get into the 5 main phases of the cardiac cycle. And again, the cardiac cycle includes everything that's happening within the heart in a single heartbeat. We'll go through these phases individually, and you can kind of fill out your packets as you go, those worksheets that you're supposed to go in. As you can see here, these 5 stages are all in a row, and each of these pictures will show arrows showing where blood flow is going. So if you remember, blood always flows from the atria to the ventricles and then out of the respective semilunar valve and the great vessels, as we call them. So from the ventricle, the right ventricle, deoxygenated blood will flow out the pulmonary trunk, and from the left ventricle, oxygenated blood flows out of the aorta. So we'll go through what happens within these chambers, which when they contract, when they fill with blood, when the chambers are completely shut off, and when pressure builds up. The graph on the bottom just shows the pressure in the left ventricle, the pressure in the aorta, the volume in the left ventricle is shown in green throughout one single heartbeat. And we see determinations between heart sounds, between the lub and dub sound. The lub is the first heart sound, and the lub sound is what a doctor listens for in a stethoscope. And the lub sound refers to the closure of the atrioventricular valves. The dub sound we call the second heart sound, and that refers to the closure of the semilunar valves in the heart. So a doctor is listening to make sure your heart valves are closing all the way. If the heart valves do not close all the way, heart can leak back into a chamber that it just recently came from, and that is heard by a whooshing noise, and that can lead to bad things to happen because if blood is going in the opposite direction, that means it's not being pumped in the way it should go, and we call that a heart murmur. Okay, so phase one is atrial contraction, where blood is pushed from the atria. As blood is pushed from the atria, it increases its volume in the ventricles, and pressure also increases in the ventricles. So blood is pushed from the atria to the ventricles in this first phase, in atrial contraction. As the volume of blood fills up the space in the ventricles, there's nowhere else for it to go, so pressure will increase inside that ventricle. And for pressure to increase is an important part of the cardiac cycle because we'll need a lot of pressure to be built up in the ventricles to get a really strong, forceful ejection of blood. Phase two is one of our isovolumetric phases, and this is what we call isovolumetric contraction. The prefix iso means same. So in this phase, there won't be any change in blood volume in the chambers. An isovolumetric contraction refers to when the ventricles begin to contract. The increase in pressure caused the atrioventricular valves to slam shut. And again, from anatomy, if you remember, your AV valves are located between atria and between ventricles. The AV valve on the right side is called the tricuspid valve, and the AV valve on the left side is called the mitral or bicuspid valve. So this increase in pressure causes those AV valves to slam shut. There's not enough pressure built up for your semilunar valves to open yet. So at this point, all the valves are closed, so we don't get any more blood flowing into the ventricles. So that's why we call it isovolumetric contraction. The volume remains stable while the pressure builds in the ventricles. And we call the amount of blood in the ventricles at this point end diastolic volume. And physicians, medical professionals are actually able to measure this exact volume by taking an image of the heart and then measuring the dimensions of the heart to get the volume of blood inside of it. So they're able to measure this amount. Then we get to ventricular ejection in phase three. So at this point, the increase in pressure has built up enough to open those semilunar valves. So your semilunar valves will open at this point, causing the ventricles to eject the blood that was in their chambers. Because the blood is exiting, that ventricular volume will decrease and blood will enter your pulmonary aorta to bring deoxygenated blood to the lungs where it'll pick up oxygen, and blood from the left ventricle will enter the aorta to bring oxygenated blood to the body systems. The blood amount that exits is stroke volume. So you might be wondering, well, doesn't all the blood leave the ventricle? And that is not the case. There's always a little blood left over in the ventricles at all times. So the stroke volume is the amount of blood that actually leaves the heart. And again, physicians can measure this amount. It's important to measure this amount in people with cardiac disease or decreased cardiac function to measure how much blood their hearts are actually pumping out. Phase four, then, we have another isovolumetric phase, but this is the isovolumetric relaxation phase. The decrease in pressure that comes because all the blood has left the ventricles causes your semilunar valves to slam shut. So this is the second heart sound that the doctor listens for in his stethoscope. The ventricular volume remains the same. And we call this end systolic volume at this point after ventricular ejection. The relaxation phase, the amount of blood left over in the heart, we call end systolic volume. And again, the blood volume remains the same because no valves have opened yet. So ventricles haven't begun filling with blood again. Then we get to phase five, which is ventricular filling. And this is kind of starting the process over again in the cardiac cycle. So ventricular filling, now the pressure in the ventricles will drop low enough after that isovolumetric relaxation phase to cause your AV valves to open again. And when that happens, blood will flow into the atria and then into the ventricles to fill up the ventricles again. The ventricular volume will steadily increase during this phase, but there's no contraction yet of any ventricles or atria because the pressure still remains very low. Okay, so this is a heart animation, and I'm actually going to show it and bring it up to a new screen so you're able to see this. And this heart animation phase is really helpful if you want to take a look at all of these phases put together in one spot. So I'm going to press play here, and there will be a lot going on in your screen because remember, the cardiac cycle takes note of everything that happens within the single heartbeat. So you'll see here that the top graph shows the pressure and volume changes between the aorta, the ventricles, the atria, and the ventricular volume. And then if we look at your ECG, the electrocardiogram, you'll notice that whenever a P wave occurs, that will occur right before your atria contract. The QRS complex, if you can look at two places at one time, that depolarization of the ventricles will occur right before the ventricles contract. And the T wave will be ventricular repolarization, and that'll occur as the ventricles relax. And then it's also interesting, fun to see how these heart sounds, specifically S1 and S2, will line up when the valves close. So take a look at your AV valves. They will close when S1 gets passed, and your semilunar valves will close at S2. S3 and S4 are abnormal heart sounds that the doctor might hear for, and those might be cause for concern, such like a heart murmur, or if the valve isn't closing all the way and it kind of gets, it closes maybe not once but twice, there would be an extra sound in there. So this is a great animation for you guys to review on your own, just to see everything in the cardiac cycle put together. So now we'll go back to our PowerPoint. And at this point, I would encourage you guys to pause the video and work on your application questions in your worksheet. So your application questions talk about heart blocks and asking you to draw ECGs between normal patients and patients with first, second, or third degree heart blocks. So first of all, what is a heart block and what does that mean? Well, the electrical signaling in the heart can be blocked really at any point between the SA node, AV node, the bundle of His and Purkinje fibers. That whole electrical signal can be blocked, and depending on where the damage occurs, usually due from a heart attack, this heart block can occur. And we're going to focus on an AV block, and a partial AV block means the electrical impulses are delayed so much that they don't reach into the ventricles and a heartbeat is skipped. And this can cause dizziness, kind of people who feel out of place. A complete AV block means zero electrical impulses are reaching the ventricles. This is obviously, as you can imagine, a medical emergency and a serious risk of cardiac arrest. A pacemaker must be implanted ASAP in a complete AV block, and that pacemaker, when it's implanted, it will have a lead that will bypass the blockage to be able to continue that electrical signal down to the ventricles because the AV node was blocked and the electrical signal couldn't get into the ventricles itself. So here is the drawing. So you'll need to draw an ECG tracing from a normal patient, a patient with first degree heart block, and a patient with second degree heart block. And again, feel free to pause the video at this point if you need time to do that, and then we'll go through the answers together. Okay, so ECG from a normal, remember each kind of section should include a P wave, a QRS complex, and a T wave, and that's one heartbeat. And then in a normal patient, it will repeat itself with the distances and intervals between each depolarization curve at a normal spacing. So ECG technicians are able to measure the distance between these curves in the graph. And if everything's normal, the patient will be normal. This interval between the P wave and the QRS complex is called the PR interval. And that interval refers to the electrical signaling being passed from the atria to the ventricles. And in a first degree heart block, you'll notice that the PR interval is just slightly longer than a normal patient. And that's because the first degree AV block has been, there's been a slight blockage in that AV node. So it's taking a little bit longer for that electrical signal to get to the QRS complex. We're still getting ventricular depolarization with each P wave. So we call that a first degree AV block. Second and third degree AV block just refer to the ratio of P waves to QRS complexes. And you'll notice in a second degree AV block, there's a 2-to-1 ratio. So every 2 waves that get sent through the atria, every 2 P waves, we only get 1 stimulus being sent down to the ventricles, or 1 depolarization of the ventricles. So here you see a P QRS complex T, and you see another P with nothing, so no response there. So nothing got to the ventricles on the second time. But then we see another P QRST complex, that looks pretty normal. But then again on the second P wave, we see no QRS complex. So for every 2 P waves, we only get 1 QRS complex that is stimulating. So basically for every time the atria contract, we only get 1 time that the ventricles will respond. A third degree AV block is a 3-to-1 ratio, so you can imagine even worse. Third degree AV block, we already see a delay in signaling getting from the P wave to the QRS complex. So we already see that this electrical signal is having a hard time reaching the ventricles anyway, but it still is at least 1 time out of 3. And then we see a second P wave, no QRS complex, a third P wave, no QRS complex. So that's a 3-to-1 ratio. So for every 3 waves, 1, 2, 3, we only get 1 QRS complex. And again, the cycle will start over, but this PR interval is so incredibly long that is cause for concern in itself. So a pacemaker would have to be put in ASAP as well. All right, thanks for listening, guys. I hope you're all doing well.